Hello, book review, Souls of Black Folk by W.E.B. Dubois. I listened to this book yesterday while I was mountain biking, and then after I came home, so I finished it in one day. Got it off of bookshouldbefree.com, the link is below. It was published in 1908 by W.E.B. Dubois, who was an African American. He was the first, I skimmed through his Wikipedia. He was the first black man to receive a doctorate from Harvard, and he helped co-found the NAACP and fought for the Civil Rights Act, which passed like a year after he died. He lived to be 95 years old. So this is basically a book talking about the sociology and psychology of black Americans, especially in slavery and post-slavery times. And it was very well written, really good vocabulary, and it's an easy read. So basically, the list of the titles of all the chapters are below, taken off of my Book Should Be Free page on my site. It's basically, talks about all of the different things that are kind of go on inside the minds of black Americans. And some of the things that I remember him saying were some of the interesting psychological things black people have to deal with, especially post-emancipation. The emancipation of slavery was a complicated time. They set up the the Job Bureau after they became free to try to help figure out how much people should pay them and how to organize all of that. And there were a whole lot of stories in the book of white people cheating black people because it was easy back then, because black people were not very literate, and they were very, very ignorant. And that's something that I think people forget, is how literate slaves were. I mean, how illiterate and ignorant slaves were. Slaves weren't allowed to read, and they weren't told anything. They were just told what to do. And when you have 4 generations of people in that kind of situation, they're just not going to know much. And that's why, if you see old movies from back in the slavery days, the black people would have totally different vocabulary, almost just super simplified English, like, yes, massa, and I got me my chidden, and just, butchered grammar, and didn't know how to read. And so they needed help when they were emancipated. And it was easy for black people to take advantage of them. There was a story of one black guy who got his freedom and worked to buy land, and he bought the land off of the person he bought the land from 3 times over. He paid for it, and then he paid for it again, and then he paid for it again, and then the white person never even gave him his deed, and he kept working for 30 cents an hour and never even got the land, because he didn't know how it worked. When they were paid, they didn't even really know how money worked. It kind of gave me reminded me of when I went to Australia. I rode through Australia, and I went to one of these outback Aboriginal reservation towns, and there are all these Aboriginals in this town, and each of them has like 20 dogs. And in the town there's one white family, and I had to go down to the house of the white guy, to open up the store for me, and an Aboriginal came, and he grabbed a bunch of stuff and then threw a bunch of money on the counter, and then the white guy had to count the money and tell him what he had to put back and help him figure out what to buy, because he didn't know how to count the money. And That's kind of, I think, how a lot of these emancipated slaves were. They were just kind of helpless, and they needed help. And Dubois was admitting that they even educated white people. Looking after them would be better for them than if they were to just take everything over themselves. It kind of reminds me of Tanzania when they got kind of more freedom for the blacks. Then they came in and robbed the farms off the white people who had been farming for generations and knew how to do it, and then they just didn't know how to do it, and so all the farms shut down because they didn't know how to farm, and then the country went down. So yeah, and then he was talking about some other psychological things. Being slaves for so long, it's not good for. They have a long way to climb. It's not good for you to be a slave, and it kind of takes personal responsibility away. And he was mentioning that black people, after they were emancipated, they didn't have any reason to have moral fortitude, have good morals, and know the difference between right and wrong. A lot of them came free, and then they just did what they could get away with doing. So there was a huge rise in crime from black people just running around and raping people, white people, and stealing from people, and but that was to be expected, Dubois said, because there wasn't an infrastructure of law enforcement in the South down there, because the law enforcement was the slave owners whipping them and keeping them in line. But now that they're free, a lot of them ran wild and became criminals, but a lot of them obviously weren't criminals and were good, and they did kind of have a system where any white person in the South could stop any black person and ask them whatever they wanted, interrogate them and ask them, like, are you the real owner of that? And tell them that they couldn't. There were even laws they couldn't get sassy with them. They're actually protected by law, and so. It's very disrespectful to the blacks, and they didn't like that. My ideas about that are, I don't think that was good. That gives white people the right to continue to walk all over them, because there were a lot of poor white people in the South, Dubois was saying, who didn't like black people, were very angry with them. Because they're ignorant and they didn't know, they thought that black people were dumb because they were black, not because they'd been slaves for so long, but also because they were competition for them for the farming. And but they were supported by the law enforcement. Whenever it was hard to get justice for black people, because in the courts, people would always side with the white witnesses, and the white people would, but then the blacks would always side with the black side, no matter who was at fault. So it was really hard to determine, what actually happened if there was some kind of, conflict or crime going on. It was very racially divided. And also amongst the demographics, he said that in a town, some example town, there was actually a street that you could, like a specific street, and on one side of the street 90% of the people were black, and on the other side of the street 90% of the people were white. And I think that was pretty typical. He said that a lot of good white neighborhoods were in the middle of black, like good black neighborhoods. But there were no good black neighborhoods next to the good white neighborhoods. So the white people were very segregated from the good black people, so they didn't really know. They didn't have much contact with respectable black people, so it was kind of hard to give them a reason to help black people come up, which was different from in the slavery days when the best of the black people were the house slaves, and that lived with the white people. So in some ways slavery was more pleasant for some people. And he was mentioning that some slaves actually, he interviewed one old man who was like 95 years old, and he said he liked the slavery days better. If you had a good master who took care of you and, you know, made all the decisions for you, and all you had to do was work and not worry about anything, and you were happy, and then you're free, and all of a sudden you have to, you know, fend for yourself legally and against all the whites who don't like you, or whites who may be ripping you off. That could be difficult. So there were some black people who liked slavery more, and so that was kind of one reason why some you know, white people would try to say that, you know, slavery days were better. He gave a story about how a lot of stories actually about how black people were cheated on, you know, like having to buy more loans and like take out loans and then have to pay more than they were told, and paid way less than they were told they were going to be paid, or less than what they deserved. One black guy, the sheriff came, and I guess some landowner said he owed him money, so the sheriff came and took all of his furniture, and that was against the law. And Dubois knew that and told him, and the guy said, well, they took my furniture anyway, the sheriff did, and so, you know, what am I going to do? So this was the first book on bookshouldbefree.com that I read that was read by a black person, which I liked. The other books, Narrative of Frederick Douglass and Slave Narratives, were read by white people, and the person who read it knew how to do the black accents from back then, the slave accents, which was interesting. Another interesting thing he said, which I thought was really interesting, that I never really thought about, was that they had kept their slavery, their African songs, and the person who read the book sung the African song, and it was some kind of lullaby, you know, maybe like 30 seconds, a minute long, or something like that, and so Dubois, who wrote the book in 1908, you know, wrote it in the book. And he read it. He heard it from one of the slaves. So, you know, late 1800s, they were still they had hung on to the same song that he said that they had for 250 years before that. So, yeah, like you know, in the late 1600s or whenever they're bringing the slaves over from Africa, they didn't speak English. They spoke their African language, and would sing their songs to their children, and their children would sing it to their children. And by 1800, they didn't even know what the songs meant, but they knew the words. And when the reader of the book read it, it sounded African to me, because I've heard African songs. I mean, African words, you know, like "buam babai boy giobaluk wada." It's just interesting to hear that, you know, that even in the late 1800s, they still had that connection, you know. I wonder if there's any black families alive today who sing the song just passed down, not because they read it on Wikipedia or heard it on YouTube or something, but because their father sung it to them, because his father and his father and his father, and they just passed down. And yeah, it kind of makes it, you know, makes it real and solid. Remembering that black people were actually stolen from Africa and brought here. They're Africans. We're so far in the future, you know, black people are just Americans, you know, but they still do speak differently, you know. Like I could tell, even the guy who wrote the book I could barely tell he was black, but you can still tell somebody. And a lot of blacks, you know, like rappers and sports stars, you hear them talk, and you know, they're blacks, and even their grammar is different, and it's a totally different language. And you know, in 2013, and they became free 150 years ago. So, and you know, between the time where they now and when they became free, is less time from when they became free and when they were first brought over from Africa, I think. So, so it's not, it hasn't been that long, and but they've been here. They were slaves for a long time, and but you know, we're not. We have all this technology around us, but we're still connected to that, to the past, and to a past that was so different from what it is now, and horrific. Dubois gave one story of a judge, and I don't know what they were talking about at the court, but the judge said, told the black guy, "Look, this is a white man's country, and white men are meant to rule this country, and you're meant to be the subordinate, and that's just how it is. And if you think that you're not, then there's going to be problems, boy. So what do you say, boy? Do you agree with me or not?" And the guy said, "Look," the black man said, "Look, I'll just do what I do to survive." And the judge said, "All right, well, this is what you're going to do." So, you know, now if this is the late 1800s, just after slavery, I wouldn't have said that as a judge, but I can understand maybe how a white judge would say that, because, you know, you're surrounded by a lot of angry black people. That's what Dubois was saying. Angry black people who kind of see their whole situation in slavery as being an evil perpetrated on them, and some of, you know, it's understandable to see that a lot of them would blame the whites and just want to, you know, kind of get recompense from the whites and rob them. And so, you know, you can't have a bunch of black people against whites who are also don't understand the ways of the whites, which is what, and all the technology and the culture, which took a long time to develop, to create all the technology and the systems that they had. You know, they didn't want America to turn into another Africa. They didn't want, you know, because Africa's a lot more primitive. So, you know, there's white culture in Europe and African culture in Africa, and the Europeans brought their European culture to America, and they wanted to keep that European culture in America. So they wanted to just make sure that the blacks, did what the whites did it the white way. And the only way for the blacks to do it the white way is if the blacks are subordinate to the whites. Because if the blacks aren't, then they'll do it the black way, which is the African way. And yeah, so, but anybody who thinks that now, that's just not, it's ridiculous, because they were brought here from Africa in like 1600s. They've been here hundreds and hundreds of years. They've been free for 150 years. White, black people have as much of a right to be the leaders of the country as the white people. We're all Americans, and the black people were cheated for a long time, and it was their labor that created the economy that grew America up. So they deserve as much, and they are as smart as we are. It just takes a while for people to become educated, especially, and you know, and it's not something that you can abolish in one generation. If no matter what race you are, if you're raised by an illiterate father who didn't know anything, you know, and your whole world is shaped by that, and your whole surroundings, your children are going to reap the consequences of that. You're not going to be able to change it in one generation unless you don't have kids until you're like 45 or 50 and you've already established yourself and you've been busting your ass your entire life studying, but that's not very likely. So, I mean, it's just something that changes, that takes generations, I think. And, but you know, after like 4 generations, after like 150 years, it's, you know, we should treat blacks like Americans and whites like Americans, and treat everybody the same. But yeah, that's just an oversimplification of the book, just the most important points that I remembered from it. But he did explain a lot of kind of what goes on in the minds of blacks, how kind of they had to, you know, in the world they had to figure out why they were in the situation that they were in, and you know, how there could be a God if he makes one man greater, you know, better than the other. How could that be? And this is one of the important books of black history. So if you read one, this would be it's a good, easy read. I got through it, listening to it in one day. I don't know how many pages it is, but I'll put the information below and the links and everything. It was interesting. All right, peace out.